We are going to discuss about the chapter 3. In this we are going to discuss about execution of the mapping which we have created previously, that is from source EMP to SPG EMP table, and to execute it we will be discussing about the workflow manager in that task developer session, workflow designer, connections, and the execution process, how internally Informatica will do. Then we also create two more maps, business case 1 and business case 2, and execute it. That will be the agenda for chapter 3. Before we go to the chapter 3, we'll review what we have discussed in previous chapter. We took an example of getting the data from source underscore EMP to SPG underscore EMP, and we discussed about in a traditional PLSQL program or SQL programming, where you define the variables begin and you define a cursor to extract the data from the source. Then you put it in a loop. In the loop you calculate salary plus commission, then you insert it, then after the loop you commit it. That is the extraction, transformation and loading of data in a programming language. When coming to Informatica as a product has two servers, repository server and Informatica server. Then it has the client tools, designer, workflow manager, workflow monitor and repository manager. And when you install Informatica, it needs a repository relational database where it will put its system tables. Through the client tool of the repository manager, you will administer, create users, privileges, folders. In the designer tool, you will develop the ETL program, which they call it as mapping in Informatica. The designer tool contains different components like source analyzer, warehouse designer, transformation developer, applet designer, mapping designer. In the source analyzer, you define the source. Your source can be a table, a flat file, an XML file. In the warehouse designer, you define the structure of your target, that is your table or a flat file, your target structure. In the transformation developer, it is used for reusable components. Applet designer is used for reusable components, and in the mapping designer, you will develop the whole mapping. In the designer tool, you develop the program in a GUI-based the whole ETL process. You can create the source definition in the source analyzer, either by creating manually or you can import the structure. We have taken manually created the source underscore EMP. Then in the warehouse designer, we created manually the structure SPG underscore EMP, and in the mapping designer, we created the mapping. Mapping is nothing but the data flow from the source to the target. And if you have any transformations, you will put the transformations in the mapping. It's a program in a GUI based. This will be stored in the repository. Basically, in the mapping, you write it for extracting, transforming, and loading the data. The program. Whereas in that, transformation is nothing but an object which Informatica provides to do specific functions. That is to modify data, to generate data. For that purpose, specific transformations are provided for specific functions. Source qualified transformation is used when your source is a relational table or a flat file. To extract the data from a table or a flat file, you use source qualified transformation. And you use expression transformation when you want to do simple calculations, non-aggregate functions. In a transformation, you will have ports. Ports are nothing but columns or fields. In Informatica language, they call it as ports. Data comes into this port and data goes out of this field or port. Which when it comes, it is called input. When it goes, it is called output. Then the data comes in and goes out unchanged. It is called as input-output port. Then, if you want to modify the data, transform the data, then you make it as output port only and you write the formula in that. So we created a mapping by defining the source EMP table. We defined the target STG_EMP, and in the mapping designer we created the mapping of source qualifier expression and the target STG mapping STG_EMP. We created one mapping and we saved it. The mapping will be saved in the repository. When you save it, it will validate the whole mapping for syntax errors, for connections to data types, and the flow from the source to the target. This is what we have discussed in the previous chapter. Now we are going to discuss in the chapter 3, execute mapping, source EMP to STG-EMP table, workflow manager, task developer, session, workflow designer, connections, and execution process, and how to create and execute mappings. So, as we discussed before, the definition you do it in the ETL program, in the designer tool. To execute that program, which they call it as a mapping, to execute that mapping, you have to access the workflow manager client tool. So this is your workflow manager client tool. You enter your username password to access the workflow manager. So in the workflow manager tool, you enter your username password. We have already provided you the username password to connect these tools. So this is workflow manager. Under this workflow manager, you have the navigator window, the workspace, and the output window. Look and feel will be the same like your designer tool. There are three components called task developer, workflow designer, and workflow designer. So whenever you execute a mapping, whenever you want to execute a mapping, the steps. First you will define the source, you define the target, then you create the mapping, that if you have any transformations, do those transformations. These are all things you do it in the designer tool. Now to execute that program, execute the mapping, the process in Informatica is, they call it as, you need to create a session for that mapping, which we have created in the designer tool. You need to create a session for that mapping. Then you need to create a workflow for that session. This you will do it through the workflow manager client tool. So this is the execution process of the mapping. So you need to create a session for that mapping, and to execute that session you need to create a workflow. These things you will do it in the workflow manager. So workflow manager contains three tools called task developer, workflow designer, and workflow designer. Regarding the workflow designer we will discuss later. Now to create a session in Informatica, to create a session you will be creating through a task developer. Through task developer you can create a session, a task. They are called as task, a unit of work. So for a mapping to be executed you need to create a session task. If you want to execute any commands like DOS commands, shell script commands, then you use shell command task. If you want to send any email, then you use email task. So using the task developer, you can create a different task like shell session task, shell command task, and email task. Session task is used for your mapping. Command task is used for task commands or shell script commands. And to send the email, then you use the email task, the task developer. And that session which you have created in the task developer to be executed, then you will use the workflow designer. Execution of the work session or any other task or the workflows will be done, created through the workflow designer, and when you execute it, whatever is there in that, the Informatica server will perform on that. So the first step of yours is to create a task. So under your folder, go to the task developer. To create a session task, you have to go to the task developer. Now create the session. Task create. It will provide you to create three types of tasks: session, command, or email. For us, we need a session task. So syntax for session task is s_ mapping name is m_ex_emp is your mapping name. S_ that is the naming convention for your session. To say create. Which mapping you need to execute by giving this through this session? To assign. You select that mapping to associate with that session. Say OK. So a session is created. A session can contain only one mapping. A mapping can contain multiple sessions. For each session, it can be assigned one mapping only. Single mapping can have multiple sessions. What I mean by that is, in the same task create session, s_m_ex_emp, I say another session. Just a name. I can assign the same mapping that session also. Means this session can contain only single mapping. A single mapping can be made for multiple sessions. Now you open it. Now we will be discussing about the properties of this session. Sessions are nothing but set of instructions assigned to the mapping. For that mapping which is assigned to that session, set of instructions. Then you execute this session through the workflow, what it should do. So this is the session tab. You can rename the session, but you cannot change the mapping which is assigned to it. If you want to change it, you have to delete the session and recreate the session. Then rename the session. Then describe it. What is reusability? We'll discuss later. Then what is set of instructions? Whenever you execute a session, that is through a workflow, you will execute it. It will create a log file. Whenever you execute, while the execution process is going on, Informatica server will create a log file. So properties, set of instructions, 90% it is default. So this is the log file name. Means whenever you execute this session, how will you execute? Through a workflow. We will discuss later. So when you execute this session, it will create a log file by the session name.log. And where it will be stored? $PM. This $PM means session Informatica server, wherever on which machine, which box Informatica server software is installed, that root directory, the path where the Informatica server software is installed, the path that is represented by $PM, and session log directory. So when Informatica server software is installed, automatically the session log directory will be created. Lot of directories will be created, under this session log directory will be created. So under that, this log file will be created. Then let us go back to the mapping. We have created this mapping. We said in the source qualifier transformation, it will write the select statement to extract the data from the source. Where it has written in the source qualifier, let us see once. Under the properties, we said there are different tabs, properties. So this is the SQL query. To extract the data from a table, you need to write a select statement. If you don't write any select statement, Informatica will write the select statement by itself, called the default select statement. You may not see it, but at runtime, when it has to extract the data, when all this has been stored in the repository, when Informatica picks that mapping through that session for that workflow, it will get the data from the source underscore EMP table. The data, how it will get it? It will have to fire the select statement. Where did you specify that select statement? In the source qualifier transformation. If you don't specify, it will write by itself a default select statement. So select. So it will extract the data. Row by row, it will transform your salary plus commission. And you just link this to the target table. That is your STGMP table. This column names you have linked. But we haven't specified anywhere insert the data into this by just linking. But to load the data into the target table, Informatica server has to fire a insert statement to load into any table. You have to insert or update or delete a statement. The DML statement has to be fired. So Informatica server, what it will do, at runtime it will fire the insert statement. But in the mapping, you haven't specified anywhere insert statement. Please observe very carefully. You don't specify insert here. Insert is this. By default, when you create a session, as a set of instructions, insert. It will be set to insert. This is treat source rows as insert, means inserting into the target table. If you select delete, it will fire a delete statement on the target table. If you select update, it will fire update statement on the target table. Data driven is used when you use a transformation called update strategy transformation. We will discuss. So insert. Then commit interval means you need to commit the data in the target table after it loads the data. When the process is going on to load the data into the target table, actual data processing, so it has to insert the data. When it inserts, it has to commit the data. So insert, it will fire an insert statement. It will commit the data into the commit interval in the target table. Then commit type, target, source, and user defined. Target based commit, they call it as source based commit and user defined commit. Target based commit means after it loads 10,000 records in the target table, it will send a commit interval. If the loading is less than 10,000 records, which after the last record is loaded, it will fire a commit statement into the target table. User defined will be used when you use a transformation called transaction control. We will discuss about transaction control, then we will refer this at the time. Regarding source based commit, you please go and read help. Because in Informatica, the best thing, one of the best documents is the help documents is one of the best after Oracle we have seen. So I want you to read help, not only just practice but start reading the help. So for your start, go and read the help. What is the source based commit type? By default it is target based. Commit interval is 10,000. You can change this values to 5,000 or whatever you want to do it. So after every 5,000 records it will send a commit. So what is our ETL process? Extraction. You have written in the source qualifier what data to be extracted. Transformation, what data to be transformed. Then load the data into the target. Set has been set here. What is the commit interval? Regarding other things, wherever required, I will be discussing about these different attributes of Informatica session properties. in configuration object, how you want to line sequential buffer, the length of the line, session log files, how much you want to have, how many runs session log file you want to have, stop on errors, means should I stop it at the first error, or as soon as the first error comes should I stop, or 10 errors, after I get 10 errors should I stop, and on stored procedure error, if you have a stored procedure transformation in it, if the stored procedure fails should I stop or continue. Pre-session command task error we will discuss later. So these are the default settings, set of instructions which Informatica does in your session properties. Whenever required will come there. So general, tester, description, properties, will create a log file. Please, log file is very important. Success or failure of your loading, it will be written in the log file. So log file will be created. Insert the rows or update or delete the rows in the target table. This is commit interval. Target based commit means after loading 5000 records, it will send the commit interval. Then configuration object, the default settings. Then I say OK. Then I say file, save. When I say save, data will be stored. That session information for that mapping through this workflow manager went to the repository server and stored in the repository of Informatica. Then, like this, you go to the session properties and you have different tabs in the sessions. The general properties, configuration object. So in the general, you define it, you description it. The properties, you set up the session log file and the insert or update or delete or target based commit intervals, and you configuration object. On first error should I stop or second error should I stop, buffer lines, then the mappings. Now you created the session as per our discussion. You need to create the session for that mapping. Then to execute that session, you need to create a workflow. So after you create the session, how to create a workflow? Go to the workflow designer and you say workflow create. So syntax for workflow naming convention is WF S underscore, then the session name, EX underscore, STG underscore EMP. So as soon as you create a workflow, it will come with the start button. Now which session you want to execute it? Which session you want to execute it? Go to the session component, drag your session. Drag and drop in your session. Then you have to link. They are called the link task. Here is the link task. Click on it, drag and drop. Then you save it. That's all you do in the workflow. And a single workflow can have multiple sessions. A single workflow in this, you can execute sessions sequentially or parallelly. We'll discuss later. So you create a workflow and you save it. So in Informatica, you have created the session, you created the workflow, start button, session task, and you linked. So link the task and you save it. You can add multiple sessions and you can execute it. Now, so session, the session properties also we haven't done anything, just I have explained you. 90% are default. We haven't changed anything in this, just I changed it for our sake, the commit interval, configuration object, and you said OK, and in the workflow you created the workflow. Now to execute this workflow, you can say right click and say start workflow. You can also schedule start workflow from here. So this is workflow. 。 Now we are going to execute this workflow. How to execute this workflow? Right click and say start. Before I go further down, all your workflow, your mapping, your session, everything will be stored in the repository. Now we are instructing that this workflow has to be executed. When you say this, Informatica server will take this information from the repository and execute this. Now you can monitor it in the workflow monitor. This is pertaining under that folder. That workflow has been executed. Under that workflow you have the session. Now it shows me failed. So why it has failed? How to know about it? What is the reason it has failed or succeeded? So you go and right click and say get session log. So it will open this log file and it will show you the whole thing. Log file. It does not look very neat, but it gives you all the information about what it has done. When you said by the time you started it, what is the repository, what is the folder, and what it has done. It has executed it, but there is an error. Table or view does not exist. We try to extract the data from source_emp, database driver error, Oracle fatal error. So it is trying to extract the data. It was not able to extract it. Table or view does not exist. So it is an error. Let me discuss why this error has come. So before we see that, let me wrap up again what we have discussed. Is to create a mapping. Then in the workflow manager you created the session. Default settings, set of instructions, assigning in the session, major or default. Then to execute that session, you created a workflow and link the task of your session, and you executed it. And in the workflow monitor, client tool, you will monitor it. But it has failed. Why it has failed or succeeded? If you want to see it, then you will access the session log file. And the session log file said table or view does not exist. Database driver error. So this is what happened. Now let us discuss why this error has come. So why it has failed? The reason it has failed is have sent the program. We have said insert the data, set the commit interval. All that is stored in the repository. That program has been taken by the Informatica server. All the information, that is, extract the data. To extract the data, it has taken the statement, haven't written to extract the data. Now, look at from a layman terms. To get the data from a database, you have to write a select statement. Before write the select, what you will do? You need to connect to that database. It is Oracle. You need to connect in SQL Plus. Connect to that database. Before you write any select statement, you need to connect to that database. The database username passwords we have given. For you it is _informatica. Set your ETL document. For me it is trainer_sr3 password and the connect string is sr3. I need to connect to the database. I need to connect that database. So after I connect it, then I will write the select statement like this. Select employee number, name, sal, permission from source_emp. So to extract the data from the source_emp, I need to write the select statement, which I have already written in my Informatica in the source qualifier. If you haven't written it, we'll write the default select statement. So we'll fire this here. But select statement is correct. But the problem is, first we need to connect to that database. So anywhere in the program, we haven't said that this is the database where this source_emp table is there. So that's why it has given you the error. Table or view does not exist. Oracle fatal error, so it is not able to connect to the Oracle database. So we need to create what we call it as connections. We should tell to Informatica that you need to connect to that database. For Informatica server, it needs information about where that source_emp table is there. Same way when it is loading the data into the target, that is stg_emp table, where is that? In which database it is? It has to know so that it can physically connect to that source and physically connect to the target at runtime while executing it. So what it needs to do? It needs to connect to the source. Then it will fire that select statement to extract the data, transform the data, and load the data into the target. To load insert, you have specified in the session properties insert, but it needs to be specified where that table exists physically. To do that, where the source and the target exist physically, in Informatica, the workflow manager client tool, you need to create connections. Not only create the connection, but you have to assign those connections to the session. There might be different types like relational connection, MQ series, FTP. There are different types of connections. Now, how to create connections, we will tell you in next few minutes. But to connect to a database, what we need? To connect to a database, we need to, if it is a relational database like Oracle, what we did in SQL Plus, we have connected by giving the username, password, and also the connect string. If we have connected to the SQL Plus. Let me connect again to the SQL Plus. So what we did, for me it was trainer_sr3 password and the connect string or the host string. Then we connected, then we fired the select statement. So we need to connect to that. So we need to create a connection. If you want to load the data into the table of STG, that is stgemp table, trainer_stg, we have given you the username password for this database also. Please check your document. You have written it in the chapter 1. And host string, I gave TGT, for you it is STG. So in this database, you have the table called stg_emp. So before you do anything on the database, you need to connect to those databases. So to create those database connections, which we call it as connections in Informatica, first we need to create those connections, then assign it to the sessions. So how to create connections? Go to connections and say relational. So these are the different connections which I have created. Then new. What is it? For different databases, different ways you create the connections. So for Oracle, say okay, give a name. Here we need to give a name. Let me give a name for myself, trainer underscore SRC batch 9, and my username, password, and the connect string for the host. I create a connection and I say okay. So you created the connection, but that is not the end of it. You have to assign that connection. You have to assign that connection so that this session at runtime, it has you said to the Informatica server, it needs to go and connect to that source. So you assign the connection. How? Double click, mapping, source. Can you do this here also, but don't do that. Here is the source. Now you assign that connection. What was the connection I created? Trainer SRC underscore batch 9. I assign. So when you execute this session at runtime, Informatica server, when you sign that connection, that session in the workflow manager, connection, you already created the connection that will be stored in the repository, then you assigned it. So at runtime, Informatica server picks that information based on the connection information, that is the username, password, and connect string. It will go and connect to that source. Go and connect to the source. Then it will fire the select statement, which we have written in the source qualifier, extracts the data, complete data. Informatica server extracts, even it is 1 million records, it will extract the complete data into the Informatica server. Then it will process row by row, record by record, one record at a time it will process. Then it will load the data into the target table. How it will load? To load the data into the target table, it has to fire an insert statement that you have specified in the session properties. By default, you have set to insert. So it will fire the insert statement. Based on what columns it will fire the insert statement? In the Informatica mapping, based on the columns which are going in. By Informatica server will write the insert statement based on the columns and the target table name. It will write an insert statement to load the data into the target table. But where is that target table? Where is that target table? Physically, where is that target table? For that, it needs to connect to that database. To connect to that database, you need to give the connection information. For the target also, that is stgemp table, you need to create another connection because it is a different username, password, and different host string. So connection, new, Oracle, I create the connection, trainer underscore stg underscore batch 9, give a name, trainer underscore stg, and the connect string. I have a different connection. I'll tell you what you need to write it. Few minutes, and I say okay. Now in the session properties of the mapping tab, go to the target and to assign that. That is my trainer underscore stg batch 9. So internally, that Username, password and connect string. Informatica will take it up. Then in the target, you change bulk to normal. What is the importance of it? Discuss later. So change bulk to normal and you say OK and save your work. So now what we have done, we have created the mapping, source target mapping, created a session. For that session, we have already, before that we have, now we have session, then workflow, assign the session. When we try to execute it, it failed because it does not know where the source is, where the target is physically. So we have created the connections for it. For that source connections, we created it. For target also, we have created it and assigned those connections to the session. Now we will execute the workflow. So we execute the workflow, right click and say start. Now let us monitor in the workflow and monitor. Now it is running. Succeeded. Session also got succeeded. Let us go and open the log file. So it has fired the select statement. It has written the insert statement by itself based on the columns. So it has requested, means requested of 14, applied for the transformation records, effected means it has loaded the 14 records into the target. So let us go and check the data. The target table, select star from stg_emp, enter. So it has loaded the data, employee number, employee name, and the total salary. So this is the whole process of your Informatica, of your sessions. So you created the connections in the connection relational database. So please open your detailed specification document. Please write it down, your connection information. You need to create the connections. I will show you again how to create the connections. Before that, you write it here. Write the name as src_your_id that we have provided you, the student ID. Then the username. The database username is src_informatica. Password is read only. And the connect string is src. Use small letters. So this is what is your connection information which you need to provide. I'll show you how to create again. So name source, the name src_your_id is on the page number 7. Under this you specify it, src_your_id, username is src_informatica, password is read only, connect string is src. Then after you have written, I hope you have written this, then also we need to create for stg. Write it as stg_your_id, the name, username also stg_your_x. This is a tag. You write it stg_your_id, whatever ID we have given, not in the tag, stg_your_id, password stg_your_id, and the connect string is stg. In the connections F, here you write it like stg_your_id. Your ID may be stanza 01 batch 9. Username is also the same, stanza 01 batch 9. Password stg_stanza. For some people it is stanza 01 or stanza 02 or whatever we have given, we have provided you. That is what is the student ID, and the connect string is stg. So this is how to specify. You write it down, then I'll go back and recreate the connections. How to create it? Please look at it once again. Task, create, connections, relational, new, Oracle, say OK. Now give the name as per what you have given here. Give the name. Here what we have given, src underscore your ID. Username for source is same for everybody. Password is also the same for everybody. And read only connect string, src, all small letters. This only changes for different users. So here you give it, right, src underscore your ID, that is stanza 01B9, and the username src underscore informatica, password read only, connect string src, and you say OK. That is for your source connection. Then again new Oracle for stg underscore your ID, like stanza 01-9. Then stg underscore your ID is the database username password, this is, and the password and the connect string is stg. This is how you create the connections. Then the workflow manager, in the session you create the session name, assign the connections, and you create the workflow. Let me create a session again. Clear all. Session create s underscore m underscore x underscore stg underscore emp underscore 1. For you it is stg underscore emp. Create. Assign the mapping. Done. Then assign the connections. Mapping. Others don't do anything. They're all default settings. Go to the mapping. Create the connection, the source. src 01B9. Say OK. Go to the stage target. Here is the connection you provide. STG. But don't forget, change bulk to normal. What is the difference between bulk and normal? I'll tell you later. So you say OK. Then in the workflow designer, create, give the name WF underscore M underscore EX underscore SD underscore EMP underscore 1, and drag your session, and the link task, click on it, then link it and save it. So this is how you create the session. You assign the session connection for source, then you assign the target connection, then change bulk to normal, then you execute it. Now we are going to discuss about the internal process of the execution of the mapping. So let us discuss the internal, how it happens, the loading process. The way you look at the mapping in the designer tool, it looks like tables and columns. That is just the graphical user interface. Internally, Informatica server, when it processes, it is a file processing. Now, we have created a mapping to extract the data from src underscore emp table and to load the data into stg underscore emp table. Now, this mapping is stored in the repository. Then we have created the session, assigned the connections, then created a workflow, and we executed it. Now when you execute it, what happens? When you execute it, what happens? The mapping with session instructions, so workflow, everything is stored in the repository. Now from the workflow manager, you said execute, that is start workflow. That instruction goes here, an internal process. Informatica server gets that information that this workflow has to be executed. So Informatica server picks that all that information of the ETL, connections and commit intervals, and the program of the select statement to extract the data, the transformation, all that, it will take it and put it in the Informatica server. Now Informatica server, based on the connection information, it goes and connects to the source, then fires that select statement, which we have written by default in the source qualifier, extracts the data, the complete data it extracts from that source table, all the data into the Informatica server, complete data into the Informatica server, 1 record or million records, it will put into the Informatica server. Then row by row, Informatica process the data row by row. That process which I am going to discuss now. So let us assume that it has extracted the data from the source database and all the data has come into the Informatica server. Then when it connects and gets the data, puts the complete data into the Informatica server by the source qualifier select statement. Then it will process the row by row and inserts into target. Using the target connection information, it will connect and inserts the data into the target. So now this is the data in your source table, that is the source underscore EMP. When it fires the select statement, it will extract the data, that is the complete data, into the Informatica server, and just giving a visualized boxes, but internally it is a file processing. So Informatica server extracts the complete data, then does the row by row process. So source qualifier will release 1 record at a time. So the first record comes out of the source qualifier, that is 7369 Smith, commission 0, salary 800, that data comes in, then goes in to the expression transformation. A single row with all the columns goes into the expression transformation. Then what we have written in the expression, salary plus commission. So it goes and calculates the salary plus commission for this record of 7369, then sends the output. So internally in the expression transformation, it will calculate as per your transformation and sends this output 7369 Smith 800 calculated salary plus commission. Then it will insert the data into the target by firing the insert statement. Then again Informatica server takes the second record, moves out of the source qualifier transformation, and that goes as an input to the expression. Then it transforms the data sal plus commission 1600 plus 300 is 1900. Then it goes out 7499 Allen 1900. Then it goes and inserts the data into the target table. So row by row, Informatica process the data. Please understand this, very important. When the data processing takes place, Informatica server will do row by row process, extracts the data and puts it into the Informatica server. So row by row it will process the data. So like this it will process the 14 records and loads the data into the target table, internally processed. Now this is the basic way of doing a mapping, assigning the connections to the session, then creating a workflow and assigning that session, then you execute it. Then Informatica server takes the data, based on the connection goes and connects to the source, extracts the data, transforms the data row by row. To each transformation data goes in, and finally it will load the data into the target row by row. This is the internal process of Informatica. Let us look at it from a developer's perspective, what we have done till now of a single mapping, the whole process in Informatica. If you have clarity on this, then subsequent mappings, whichever we do, we will be focused on the mapping and the logic rather than what Informatica server is doing. So in the very first beginning only, as part of our training, we will discuss this. What is the ETL process? After you get the ETL specification document, based on the source, you define the structure of that source in the source analyzer. Then you define the structure of the target in the Informatica Designer using the warehouse designer. Structure, definition. Then you define the mapping which has the source, transformation and target in the mapping designer. We'll create a mapping and we will create the whole process which is called as a mapping. Then when you save that mapping, it will check for syntax errors. It will check and validate the mappings. That is, it compiles. Syntax errors it compiles, and if it is any error, it will throw up the error. If there are any errors in the mapping, it will say invalid. If not, it is a valid mapping. So this is how you do the process of development. Define the source, define the target, create a mapping, include the transformations, validate it, and then finally the mapping will be saved in the repository. Under that folder for that repository name, it will be saved. Then the next step in the execution process, now we need to execute that mapping. To execute that mapping in Informatica, you need to create a session and assign that mapping to it. To create a session, Informatica provides you with a client tool called Workflow Manager. Workflow Manager contains three components: Task Developer, Workload Designer, and Workflow Designer. Workload Designer we will discuss later. In the Task Developer, you will create a task. Task can be a session task or command task. Command task is DOS commands or shell commands. If you want to execute, you will create a command task. You want to send an email, then you create an email task. So for us, we will create for the mapping a session. Session is nothing but a set of instructions. That is set of instructions. So what is that? There are all default. It will create where to create the log file. What is the commit interval? Should I insert the data? Or if there are any errors, how many errors should I stop? If stored procedure is there, if stored procedure transformation fails, then what should we do? All this, stop or continue, all this will be done in the session properties. 90% will be default settings, default instructions, what that session should do when it gets executed. But to execute that session, you cannot directly execute. That is, it has to be assigned to a workflow. So when you assign to a workflow and save it, it will be saved in the repository. Session and the workflow will be saved in the repository. Now, to execute the workflow, then Informatica server will take that mapping information, that session information, what to extract, what to read the data from the source, what transformation should load, what data to be loaded, that which we have written in the mapping in a GUI based, but internally it will be stored in the repository database, but the process will be done by the file processing of Informatica server. So when you say execute, then what happens? Now, mapping contains what to extract the data, what transformation should be done, what load to be done, and inserting the data we have assigned in the session properties, which is a default. Then the challenge. Now when Informatica server executes that program, the challenge is where is that source, where is that target physically, somewhere it has to be located. So we need to create, in this example of where is that source EMP table and where is that target STG EMP table, where are these tables? Physically, the source is in the SRC database, and but how to access the source? how are we going to access a source from Informatica? For that, we need to, before you access, but any database in this world, if you want to access it, it is the username, password, and the connect string or the host string. To connect to a Oracle database, you need to provide that username, password, and the connect string, and that has to be assigned to that mapping, which will be assigned in the session properties. But how to assign it? That is called as connection. You need to create the connection for it. That is the name, password, and the connect string. Same way, you are going to load the data into the STG. How to access the database? It is SRC or STG, any database. How will you access? Using username, password, and the connect string. For that, we will have to assign this username, password, and connect string for that mapping in the session properties. This is called as connection. Now we will create the connection so that it has to be assigned to that session. So we will create the connection in the task in the workflow manager. Then we will assign those to the source and the target. So after you assign these connections, change bulk to normal and save your workflow, then execute it. And as we discussed before, Informatica server goes and connects to that source, gets the complete data into the Informatica server, row by row. It will process the data. Then after processing the data, it will go and insert the data into the target. To connect to the target, it needs the connection, which is the username, password, and connect string which we have created. That name will be assigned to that session in the session properties under the mapping tab. Then Informatica server will load the data. This is how the loading process takes place in Informatica. So have clarity, have clear process, cleared. If you get this clarity clear, then all the mappings which we do subsequently will be very easy and easy to understand it. But you need that how Informatica tool works. What is this connection? What is the source, target, analyzers, warehouse designer, mapping designer, session, workflow manager, execute. So whenever you do a mapping or a program or a ETL in Informatica, this is the process you have to follow. So you have the ETL specification document with you. What I do in this training program is, I'll do as per chapters. I will do 2-3 mappings, do the execution process and complete it. Then after you listen to this chapters, you need to take time and do the lab, because one step after another step I cannot stop in this training program. So they will give you a complete set in the ETL specification document. You write it down. Then after the explanation is over, chapter wise, we will give you time so that you can do the lab yourself. Then the next step is business case 1. In my Informatica training, we have taken a small case study. We will extract the data from source, load the data into staging, and from staging to the dimensions and the fact tables. So we have done one small example of the complete life cycle process of a single mapping, how it gets executed and all that stuff. Now the second business case 1. The purpose of this business case is to extract the data from source dealership table and load the data into STG_dealership table. This is the specification document which is provided in your ETL specification document which we have given you. So this is your STG dealership. You need to use it. I think this 3.1 session workflow STG_EMP, you might not have filled it. I think you have filled it fine. If you haven't filled it, I'll go back there so that you can write that Please write it down this. That is your session name, source connection name, target connection name, SRC underscore your ID, STG underscore your ID, and the workflow name. So when you create your mapping and the session and all, please follow this naming convention. Now, let me go to our business case. It needs to extract the data from source dealership table and load the data into STG dealership. Now, what we said, whenever you want to create a mapping, first you need to define the structure of source and the target, and then create the mapping. Let us go to the designer tool where we will discuss. Now I need to define the structure of source dealership table, which is under the source analyzer. How can we define the structure? Previous example, you can say source, create, and start creating that manually. You create your own structure, that is manual, but in Informatica, it's a tool, so it gives you a provision that you can create the structure not only by manual, you can get the structure from import from the database directly. You can import the structure directly from the database. Where is that table in the database? For me it is trainer underscore SRC. For you it is SRC underscore Informatica, read only the password, and the connecting is hosting is SRC. So select star from source underscore dealership. So this is the data in your dealership table. Describe source underscore dealership. This is the structure of that table. One way of defining the structure in Informatica under the source analyzer, you go and create the structure. That is cumbersome effort every time typing the columns and all that stuff. So if the table is already existing in the database, Informatica tool provides you with an option to import the structure from the database. Go to the source and you say import. But here I want to introduce you something called as ODBC. So what is this ODBC? Open Database Connectivity, or Open Database Connection. Now yours is an Informatica tool, that is the designer is an Informatica tool, the product, the software. Now to get the structure from the database, this is a Oracle database, we need to get the import the structure of source dealership table from this database. How to connect it? From Informatica to that database, to import the structure, not the data, please import the structure. You cannot connect it directly from Informatica to Oracle database because these are called third-party tools. Informatica is a third-party tool from the perspective of in Oracle. If it is Oracle native tools, like what is the native tool in Oracle? This is SQL Plus. You click on SQL Plus, you give the username, password, then the host string or the connect string, then it will give you access to the Oracle database. This is called native. Same product from the same family of Oracle, so they have their own provision how to connect to your native. But from Informatica, to connect to the database, you cannot connect directly. So they use a third-party tool, a small utility program called ODBC. This is a small software to connect to databases. Connect to a databases. So where is this software? When you install Informatica client, automatically these softwares will be installed on your machines. So through Informatica, to connect to a database, first step is you need to create a ODBC connection to get the structure from that database. Structure only, not the data in the designer tool. To get the structure, you need to create a ODBC connection, a ODBC software to be used. How to use that in Informatica tool? Please observe it. So to import the structure from a relational source, a table or a view, through source analyzer, you cannot directly connect because Informatica is a third-party tool, so you use a ODBC connection. So using the ODBC connection, you connect to the relational database and get the structure. So how to do it in Informatica? I'll go back, source, import from database. Source, import from database. Here is the button to create that ODBC. This is a ODBC tool built in by Informatica. You have user DSN, system DSN and file DSN. For more information, please read yourself about ODBC. So I take system DSN. Now you say add. I am using a program. A ODBC program has to be assigned. For different databases, different programs are created, the small programs. For us, we need Oracle. So we assign that. We say add. So these are the different drivers, they call it as ODBC drivers, which Informatica provides you when you install it. So I take Microsoft ODBC for Oracle, then say finish. And I'll give a name. I will give a name to this. That is trainer batch SRC. For trainer SRC, I give a name and don't need to give the username password except the connect string of the server where I am connecting to SRC, because my table source dealership is in SRC connect string. So when you go into the projects, you need to ask what is the connect strings and all that stuff, what is the username password to connect to the database. So you create a ODBC connection trainer underscore SRC and say okay, it is already there. Overwrite it and I say okay. So trainer underscore SRC, I have created one ODBC connection and I will use that. That is trainer underscore SRC. Then I will give my username password. So what will happen? From Informatica, when I say OK, connect, based on that ODBC connection which I have created, that utility program will connect to the Oracle database. Which database it has to connect? In the ODBC we have specified SRC, so it will create a connection between the Informatica designer tool and the Oracle database. For that purpose only you will use ODBC. It will create a connect, it will connect. But to access the database, you need to give them the username and the password. So you provide the username and password. Owner name is nothing but a schema name. So by default, this is what it is. Then you connect. Now this has connected to the database, to that ODBC connection. It has went and connected to the database. Now I take the source underscore dealership and say OK. So it imports the structure only, not the table, not the data from this table. So this is the source table structure. You could have created manually, but this is best way to import the table structure, because if they have lot of columns, we have to type it and all that stuff, rather than you define the source structure. Please open your ETL specification document. In that you write this type of ODBC. I will show you once again how to create it, but you please write down system DSN, Microsoft ODBC for Oracle. This X is your ID, Stanza, whatever ID we have provided, underscore SRC, and the server is SRC. Please create this connection when you do to import the data. Sorry, ODBC connection I should say. When you do the program, when you want to import the table structure from Informatica Designer tool, okay, then again I will do it. How? Source, import from database. As Informatica cannot connect to the database directly because it is a third-party tool, so you have to use ODBC connection. And database connectivity is a small utility program which connects to different databases. These programs, this software, this, or you call it as drivers, are installed along with the Informatica client tool, a converting tool basically. So say new. Here is the button. Please observe it. ODBC data source. Here is the button. Then you say system DSN. This is what I am saying. System DSN. Then you say add. Select Microsoft ODBC for Oracle and give a name to it. I have given already the name, so I will give trainer underscore SRC underscore 1, but you give the name as your ID underscore SRC. Then no description, no username, just the server, that is the source string, and you say OK. So one ODBC SRC underscore, you drop down box, you take it and you enter your username password. That is what it is. SRC underscore Informatica. Hit the tab, then you give your password and you say connect. For me it won't work because I have a different user ID password. So what I'll take it as trainer underscore SRC connect. So it will go and connect to that database. Then it will show me all the table structures, tables which are there in that database. Then I will import that table structure. Let me take this and say OK. So it will import me the structure. There are no columns in that, so it has not given me, just a dummy table. So I want to delete it. So how to delete it? Select it. When you select it, this borderline comes. Hit the delete key on your keyboard. That table will be deleted, that structure. So this is how you import the source structure in the source analyzer. Now as per my ETL specification document, you need to import the table source dealership and load the data into STG dealership. So you created the connection, the ODBC connection. Using that username password, go and import the table structure. So please write it down this. In 4.7.1, your ID underscore SRC, which you have created this ODBC connection, data source name, username, and read only. So to import the source table, source dealership, please write down this. So using this ODBC connection, SRC underscore Informatica, read only, you will insert the data, insert the structure, import the structure from the database. Now you need to go to the warehouse designer, import the table structure, or you can create it manually. So to import from the database, you can do it here also. So I say import from database. Here also you need to create a ODBC connection because Informatica is trying to connect to a database and it is a different database, that is STG database. You need to connect. So create system DSN, add Microsoft ODBC for Oracle, give a name. For me, I'll give it as trainer underscore STG. For me it is TGT, for you it is STG only. So say OK. So trainer underscore STG, I will use that. Trainer underscore STG. My username is also the same. Password. Connect. You have to hit the tab. Owner name will come. Don't need to type the owner name. You just after enter the username, you will hit the tab. Then enter the password. It will show you all the tables which are there under that schema in that database, for which we need STG underscore dealership. So I click on it. Then you save it. So this is your target structure. So please go ahead and write this in your sheet of paper. That is system DSN, Microsoft ODBC for Oracle. Data source name is your ID underscore STG name. It is just a name, a identifier. But server is the important to which database it has to connect. So you write that STG. So system DSN, Microsoft ODBC for Oracle. Username, that is student name underscore STG. Just a name for us to make you understand. Then the connect string is STG. So this is how you create the database ODBC connections so that you can import from the database. Go to that H in your retail specification document and write this system DSN Microsoft ODBC for Oracle, and then go to that 4.7.2 to import the target table. Use that data source name which you have just created, named the username is underscore your ID, password underscore ID. Okay, I hope you might have written this. Then the next step. So we have defined the source, we have defined the target. Now to create a mapping. As per the ETL specification document, this is a very straightforward mapping. We call it as just the source and the target. You need to load it. So we define the source, we define the target. Now we define the mapping. Mapping, create. The mapping designer, go to the mapping designer, create the mapping. What's the name? Naming convention, M underscore, put 1 here for this lab. Generally you don't put 1 numbers there, you put only the target table name, but the business cases, so you will be knowing which mapping numbers you are doing it. Then STG underscore dealership is your mapping name. This is already there in your ETL specification document which we have provided. This is the mapping name. Now I drag my source. Based on your ODBC name, what you have given, it will create like this. Drag your source dealership. Then drag your target, STG dealership. I toggle this. So this is your source and this is your target. Why you got a source qualifier transformation? Because whenever your source is a relational or a flat file, source qualifier will automatically come, and you need to use source qualifier transformation when you will use the source as a table or a flat file. It is mandatory in a mapping, this source qualifier transformation. The purpose of source qualifier transformation is to query the data from the database if it is a table. So to get the data from a database, you need to write a select statement. Informatica allows you to write the select statement in the properties, or you can modify that select statement. You can do homogeneous joins or where clause, distinct, order by, but this is not applied for, SQL properties are not applied for your flat file sources. Source qualifier properties do not apply to flat file sources. So please observe, how will it write? It will write a default select statement by itself. If you don't write a select statement on this properties tab, it will write a default select statement. How does it write? By default, the select statement. Now you say generate SQL, it will give you an error. Cannot generate a query because there are no valid fields projected from the source qualifier. What is this error means? Yes, it writes a query based on the columns you take out. It writes a query based on the columns you take out, and based on the source on which it is there, based on that it will write the default select statement. If you don't take the columns out, it will give that error. Now let's go back, properties, and this is generate SQL. Now based on two columns which we have taken out, it has written the select and from clause. Now if I take all the columns out and put it into my target, you look at the default select statement, what it will write. So at runtime, this select statement will be fired onto that database and it will extract the data. Then if you don't write it, you write that select statement and then save it. So this is the purpose of your source qualifier transformation. So already you have written 4.7.1, that is to import the source table and to import the target table, the STG dealership. So this is your mapping, which first mapping after that example in the case study you have built this. Now to execute this, what we do? To execute a mapping after you have created it, then you have to go to the session properties workflow manager. Before that, let me do this mapping again once for you so that you will have clarity. I have already imported the source structure. I have already imported this target structure. Go to the mapping designer, say create m_1_stg_dealership_1. Then I will drag my source dealership and I drag my STG dealership to dealership to this. Based on what I am connecting these columns. Based on what I am connecting these columns, this port is as per your ETL specification document. Here it has written dealership ID to STG dealership ID, manager ID to this, description to this, city, state, region, country to this. So I am linking these ports to the different columns as per my ETL specification document. When you say arrange all iconic, so it gets arranged. Okay. Save. When you save it, it passes the whole mapping. And if there are any errors, it will give you. If there are no errors, it will say valid mapping. Now to execute this mapping, you need to create a session. So in a brief, what we do, define the source structure in the source analyzer. As this is a table to be imported from the database, so what we did, Informatica cannot connect directly, so we created the ODBC. Then using that ODBC and the username, password, we have connected to the database, to the SRC database and imported the table source underscore dealership. Same way to define the target, we went to the warehouse designer and we have put the table from the database. To do that, we create the ODBC for the target, that is for STG. Then we have imported the STG underscore dealership. Third step, we created the mapping. In that we use the source qualifier transformation, because whenever your source is a table or a flat file, you have to use source qualifier transformation. The source qualifier transformation will write a default select statement statement, you don't write it, based on the ports taken out from the source qualifier and based on the source, it will write the select statement. So you have created this mapping. Now to execute the mapping, what we need to create a session and assign the connections, then create a workflow and execute. So to create a session, we need to go to the workflow manager under the task developer. Let us create a session. Task, create session. What should be the name? This underscore, the mapping name, 1 underscore, STG underscore, dealership, they create. Now you take this mapping, you say OK, done. What we should do to this? We have to assign the connections. Which connections we will assign? You don't need to create every time connection going to the task, going to this connection, and you don't need to create it. If it is a new database, new username, password, new schema, then you have to create a new connection. But these tables are in the SRC database. Already for that we have created it for source underscore EMP. We will use that connection rather than recreate it. So mapping, which connection? SRC underscore. You assign this connection, but I will assign my connection, that is trainer underscore SRC batch 9, then STG dealership, trainer underscore SRC batch 9, or whatever you want to call it as, TGT. Sorry, STG. Change bulk to normal. Whatever the name I have given, which you have given in the ETL specification document which you have created, those connections I am assigning it. In F and E and F, the connection information which you have created, the name I am assigning it because those tables are in the sources in that SRC database, and the STG underscore dealership is in the STG database. So I am assigning the same connection and saying change to bulk to normal, and you save it. Then go to the workflow designer, workflow, create WF underscore S underscore M underscore 1 underscore STG underscore dealership. Then you drag your session and link it and save your. Before I execute this, please go ahead and write it in 4.8 of your ETL specification document. S underscore M underscore 1 underscore STG underscore dealership and SRC underscore your ID. That is the connection name which you have already created, your student ID, the previous. Then the target connection name STG underscore your ID, that name you have created, and you create the workflow. This is the workflow you should use when you are creating the workflow. Please write it down. Don't miss anything. Don't try to do mappings while I am doing it. Focus. So please write it down, whatever we are asking you to do it. I hope you might have written this. Now let me execute it. Let me execute this. Right click, say start workflow. Opens the workflow monitor and it is running. Succeeded. Then I'll go to my log file and see requested 31, applied 31, and affected 31. So has it loaded right or wrong? Let me go first to my source. There are 31 rows in my source. Now I'll go to my STG trainer underscore Don't worry, for me it is TGT, for you it is STG. Then say select start from STG underscore dealership. So it has loaded 31 rows, the target table. Now we will do the second mapping for this chapter 3. This is also straightforward. This mapping will load the data into the payment staging table, source payment to STG payment. So as per my requirement, from source payment to STG payment, you need to extract the data and load it. Straightforward, no transformation work. But as per our informatica process, first we need to define the structure. Let me clear this. I will go and import from the database. I will use the same ODBC connection name because I am going to the same database of SRC to get the STG underscore payment table structure. So I will use my same connection and enter my username password to get my table called STG source underscore payment structure. Then go to the target, import from database, STG only I will take it because I am connecting to the same database. So I don't need to create another ODBC connection every time. If it is for the same database, use the same ODBC connection, connect it and get my STG payment structure. This is just the structure and you save it. So defining it, so you go ahead and open your sheet of paper 5.7.1, write that ODBC connection, username and password. ODBC connection for target, that is your STG payment table, you write it down, that ODBC and the username and the password. So it will be useful, this document will be useful for you when you do the lab. After this example, you can go ahead and do all the 3 mappings. Please keep the sheet beside you, write it down, good exercise, good reference to. I hope you have written this. So after you have written this, we have created, let me create the mapping. Mapping name, create M underscore 2 underscore STG underscore payment. Drag my source, drag my target, I connect it. How do I know I need to connect to these columns? Based on my detailed specification document. This is stage to payment, payment ID to payment ID, payment type to payment type. So you might have written on this, icon 7.2. Now I will create a session log, session for this mapping. Way to create, under the task developer, task, create, name of the session, S underscore, M underscore 2 underscore STG underscore payment. Then assign that session. Connections, same connections which we have created. Assign that. No need to create a new connections for this. Source and the stage. Change bulk to normal and you say OK. Now go to the workflow designer, say create WF S underscore M underscore to underscore stg underscore payment, then drag my session, then I hit save this. Before I run this, go ahead and write it in 5.8. This information, don't forget it, please write it, have discipline, have focus. Because without writing this, you cannot get practice and you will fail in the future. When the training is completed, if you want to refer it, then you will out. So I request all of you to write whatever exercises. It will help you a lot. Training program. I hope you have written this. Now let me execute this. Before I execute, let me check the data in the STG payment star from STG. No records. This is in STG. Let me check the data in select star from source underscore payment. So there are how many records? 5 records. When you execute this workflow, it has to load 5 records into my target table. Then you right click and say start. So let me go to the workflow monitor and it has executed. Let me open my log file and see the data. Extracted 5, applied 5. So let me go back to the database and check. Has it loaded the stage payment table? It has loaded the 5 records. So this is how you create the mappings, sessions, and the workflows. So with this, I'm done with my chapter 3. So please go ahead and do these mappings. Then later on, then in the chapter 4, we'll discuss other things.